Hi everybody, we're back again. This is going to be another tech video, and today we're going to cover 2.5 ton center chunks. Just as a disclaimer, what we're not going to discuss today is how to completely rebuild the center chunk. As it kind of stands, this video is going to be more for the off-road, mud truck kind of guys. We don't, at this time, 2.5 ton chunks are still pretty easy to find. They're obviously used, but they're not getting so hard to find that you need to rebuild an entire center chunk. And the other thing to mention too is that it's quite in-depth and expensive to build one of these. All the shims, or all the bearings and everything are all shimmed, and there are some pretty expensive bearings in here once you start pricing things out. So it makes more sense just to find a good used chunk, give it a quick inspection, drop it in your truck, and go play. So that's what this video is going to be about today. Okay. Like I said, what we're going to do is go over kind of a general inspection on these chunks. Another thing that we are going to cover in this video is if you plan on putting in a spool or a locker, there will be a tutorial on how to properly do that, to disassemble it and then reassemble the chunk. The thing to note that if you are wanting to rebuild a chunk like entirely, the thing to do is to purchase one of our manuals and to do it as per the manual. So don't follow this video. This is just a general guideline for used chunks and the Weekend Warrior. Definitely not something you're going to want to, drive across the country with. So to get started, what we're going to do is we found our old chunk here, pulled it out of an old rear axle we had laying around because the fronts and the rear chunks are identical, so it doesn't matter which one you find. The first thing to do, obviously, and you can do this before you pull the chunk out of the axle, is pop out the drain plug or the fill plug, have a quick look, make sure the thing isn't completely full of rust. That's one common issue. Saves you a little time instead of pulling a rusty chunk. A little bit of surface rust on the bowl gears and even the carrier. It's common and it really doesn't hurt nothing. The other thing to check too that you can check before you pull it is your pinion bearings. All you got to do is just kind of give these things a little pull in and out. They should be tight. There should be no play in them. If there is play, it's an indication that they're starting to wear out. And if you have the option, it might be best to just leave that chunk and grab one that the pinion bearings are tight. This one too, you can see there's a little bit of oil leaking. Sometimes that's an indication that the bearings are starting to wear too, but not always, as seals wear out from time to time. Okay, so we got this one on the bench. Check the pinion bearings. Pinion bearings feel okay. A little bit of surface rust, nothing to be concerned about. The next thing we want to check before we get into this thing is just have it roll it over, check for any damaged teeth or excessive wear. If you start to see flaking on any of the gear teeth, it's a good sign that this thing is kind of at the end of its life. Any chipped or broken teeth, you're going to want to probably steer away from this thing too, as a broken tooth isn't going to get any better, it's only going to get worse. And it can cause a lot of damage to other parts in your axles. Okay, so this part looks okay. There's no visible damage, a little bit of surface rust. We'll clean that up, it'll be just fine. What we're going to start off with here is cutting all this tie wire off. As you can see, this is actually how it came out of the military axles, so it's nothing, you don't have to do it like you would on a Boeing 747 that's flying through the sky or anything like that. It's just to keep these bolts in case they ever back off. So what we'll do is we'll cut this off and pull these cap screws. They're 13/16. This little retaining clip here for the side adjusters is just a 1/2 inch wrench. And then the bowl gear is a 7/8 and 13/16. So we'll go ahead and do that and stop it. Okay, we cut all the tie wire off. The thing I should mention is if you have an open carrier in your truck, obviously you don't need to pull this out. You can skip this step. You can leave this all assembled and move on to the next step. This one, we're going to install a spool or a locker just to show how it's done. So we do need to remove this bowl gear and carrier. The thing you want to do is once you got all this tie wire cut off and loosen these cap screws off, you want to make sure that your side adjusters and your bearing caps and your bearing races stay to their appropriate sides. You don't want to mix and match and move them around left to right. So usually what we'll do is we'll mark it. You can use a paint pen, or if you're thinking you're going to use a lot of solvent, you can mark it with a couple punch marks. Usually one punch mark on either side. Same with the adjuster, just so things don't get mixed up. Usually what I'll do is mark it with a paint pen and just lay it out so it's in the correct orientation as it's going to be assembled, is usually what I'll do. So we're going to go ahead and do that. Okay, we got everything loosened off. We're going to go ahead and remove these caps. Just lay them out the way that they should be. Sometimes these will take a little tap from just a plastic hammer. The bearing itself will stay on. It's a press-on fit, so you don't have to worry about losing that. And when you pull these off, you're going to want to give your bearing races a quick inspection too. This one's got a little bit of surface rust going on in there. We'll wipe it down with a rag. Just make sure that there's no pitting or flaking in there. As long as it looks good, these will be okay to be reused. Okay, now that the bowl gear is removed, we're going to flip it over and we're going to have a look at the ring and pinion, make sure everything looks good inside of there. You just take a 9/16 wrench or socket, and you'll probably need something just to kind of pry this lid loose. Usually there's a pretty heavy gasket that's holding this down. So we're going to go ahead and do that. Okay, we're going to pull this off. If you got some real heavy dirt or mud or grease on here, you might want to just scrape it off. Use a wire brush to kind of clean it off, just so it doesn't all drop in there and you have to clean it out. So we're going to pull this off. And inside you can see the ring gear here and the pinion gear there. Same thing as the bowl gear. We're just going to spin it over, give each tooth kind of a general inspection, make sure there's not any heavy wear, any broken teeth, anything like that. This is more susceptible to rust. So if you have a little bit of surface rust, kind of the stuff you can sort of buff off with maybe a little Scotch-Brite, it's not going to hurt too much, especially if you're using it off-road. But if it's some real heavy, thick rust that's actually pitted the gear, it's, you're kind of pushing your luck and you might want to look at getting a different chunk. Okay, the next thing that we're going to check is the backlash on this ring and pinion. When it comes to these chunks, once you start getting into this crown gear, I guess it's called a spur gear counter shaft. There's a bunch of bearings in here. There's 2 tapered cone bearings that are back to back. And then you'll have a big roller bearing right here that it rides on. And once you start getting into that kind of stuff, 1, bearings get expensive, and 2, there's a lot of labor involved because you need to set all these bearings up properly. You have to set the the preload on them. And then once you get that done, then you have to reset your tooth pattern, the backlash on your ring and pinion, and then possibly, replace anything in here that's damaged as well. So what I typically do is I take a little bar, put it behind this ring gear and check, or crown gear, and check for any play back and forth. This one's tight. There's no slop in there. If there is, 90% of the time, I'll just take all this and throw it in the scrap bin because it's no good. The amount of money that it's going to cost to redo all that, you may as well just go find another chunk. Okay, the next thing I like to do, and this is only dependent if you have a dial indicator, is to check the backlash between the ring and pinion. What I'll start to do is hold the pinion shaft from turning so it can't go anywhere. I'll put a pair of vice grips on the yoke, just let it hit the bench so it can't turn. Set your dial indicator up on the ring gear tooth, zero it, make sure that it's solid, it's not going to go anywhere, and then just move the ring gear back and forth. You can see this one's just under 15 thou. The spec for the backlash is 5 to 15 thou, so this one's just on the edge of the maximum allowable spec. If you do decide that you want to tighten it up, what you'll need to do is back here, there's two sets of shims. The shim between the carrier and the bearing retainer plate, that's where you'll need to either add a thinner shim or remove a shim. And what that'll do is it'll push the crown gear just slightly into the pinion gear, and it'll tighten up that spec a little bit. The second set of shims between the two plates, that's what actually sets the preload for the bearings. So as mentioned before, if you do decide to open this up, it can be a can of worms, and I will highly recommend getting yourself a shim kit and a manual before you start doing that, or as mentioned before, maybe find yourself a different chunk. Okay, and the next thing I like to do is I always like to throw in a new set of pinion seals, because we are going through the time to inspect this chunk. It will be in relatively decent condition, meaning that it's not going to blow up 10 minutes after you put it into your truck. So while it's on the bench, it's nice to just knock these flanges off, pull the seal, drop in a couple new seals, and then this thing's going to be watertight. It'll keep the dirt and mud out of all your gears and bearings and everything else, and it should be pretty reliable for quite some time. So to do that, you got a crown nut here on the pinion flange. You just have to pop the cotter pin out of that. It's an 1.5 inch socket, pulls the nut off, and 90% of the time these should slide off without a puller or even a little tap from a plastic hammer. Don't get too aggressive because you can bend this flange. Okay, we've got our yoke off. It's basically just crown nut, flat washer, and then the yoke, and it just slides off. Check this surface, make sure there isn't a real bad groove in there or any rust or corrosion. This one looks pretty nice. This is obviously your pinion shaft and the seal. And what we're going to do is, it's tempting to pull this retainer off because you can just knock the seal out, clean it up, and away you go. But as soon as you do that, you're going to disturb all these shims in here, and what that does is it sets the tooth pattern on the pinion gear against your crown gear. So unless you absolutely have to, because there's some play in here or the bearings are wore out, I really like not to disturb those. I like to leave them just the way they are. So the easiest way I've found to pull these seals is an actual seal puller tool. You can get these at any Napa or auto parts store, and they work quite good. Just kind of fits in here, and you can just pry the seal out. Some can be difficult, some come easy. Just try not to damage the housing, and if you do, make sure you clean it up before you install the new seals. Okay, we've gone and removed the pinion seal. I just wanted to make a note of it here. If you get a real stubborn one, what you can do as a little trick is take a chisel and basically smash the seal. You want to make sure you don't hit the housing, so don't get too close to the OD of the seal, but you can smash it in, and what that does is it kind of turns it into an oval, and as soon as you do that, the seal will actually pull out of there quite easy. You can see the back side here, and it definitely helps because some of these can be pretty stubborn. So now we're just going to set this stuff aside. We're going to move on to the actual carrier. Okay, next thing we're going to do is disassemble this carrier here. We're going to end up installing a Yukon locker in this one, so I'll kind of show you how to take it apart, install the locker, and a few key points. First thing that you want to keep in mind is before you disassemble anything is have a look inside of these little ports here before you start undoing any bolts. This one you can see just has the stock spider gears in it. You can move them by hand. And the thing that you have to be careful of is if you go to install one of these Detroit style lockers, this one's actually made by Yukon, same principle, is you'll see it has these large springs here. This one's actually caged, so it's got a bolt holding it together. And when you install this, the carrier halves are holding these heavy springs together. And if you go and tear this apart and pull these bolts out without doing anything with these springs, it's going to fly apart, potentially causing some injury. So if you look to the ports and you see these large springs here, make sure that you run a bolt through it and you cage those springs before you take anything apart. And that's very, very important, and it's kind of something to keep in mind just to keep you safe. Next thing we're going to do is just cut off this old tie wire. We're not going to be reusing it, so you can just snip it, pull it out of the crown bolts. You'll need a 13/16 and a 7/8 socket or wrench to pull pull these bolts apart, and we're going to go ahead and do that. Okay, now that we have all our bolts out, the two carrier halves will split apart. Sometimes if there's some corrosion, they can be a little bit difficult. It is a tight, kind of like a machined fit. So you do kind of have to wiggle it a bit, and these two halves will come apart. I'll show you that here. If it does get stuck, you can give it a little tap here, obviously not on the bearing, and I'll show you what it looks like apart. Okay, here's the stock differential apart. Two halves split apart. You can see here bolt holes fit through the ring gear or the bowl gear. The spiders, they would normally sit in here like this. This is your open differential. If you're installing a locker or a spool, everything has to be removed, including the spiders, the little shims on the end of the spiders, they have to come out too. You don't put any of those back in there. These here fit in there, they have to be out of there. And then your side gears, you have to remove them along with the side gear shims. You specifically do not want any of these side gear shims in, especially with a Detroit locker. It will wreck them. So make sure these are on the bench when it's assembled. Same with the other side here. Pull it out, and that's it. Now I'll get this all cleaned up. I'll get everything kind of tidied up, and I'll show you how to install the Detroit locker. Okay, once I get everything apart, I like to just go through and clean everything. So that includes all your bearings, gears, clean your bolts, flanges, yokes, clean up the chunk, wash a bunch of solvent up through the bottom, let it flush out through the gears and everything, make sure there's nothing sitting up inside of it. Also these side gear pieces, the threads, make sure that they're wire brushed. There's no crud sitting in them. Same with the caps. And these caps here on the chunk, make sure everything's cleaned out nice and good so these adjusters can spin freely. When you're doing that, give everything a good once over. Make sure your races don't show any real bad wear or nothing. Make sure there's no pitting or rust damage in them. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, we're going to keep this specific to kind of the off-road guys. That means that if you have a bowl gear with a little bit of surface rust on it, it's going to be okay to run. You just want to make sure that there's no real deep pitting or wear or damage or anything like that. Then you're going to want to consider finding a different chunk or replacing these gears. As mentioned, if you're, say for example, you're daily driving a truck with 2.5 tons or you're planning on going on a big road trip, then I would recommend not running anything with any damage. Replace your bearings, your gears, any sort of consumable part, just to make sure you're doing okay. If you're only using it on the weekends, mud bogging, this stuff will be okay to run. As long as it looks in decent condition, I would recommend going ahead and using it. So with that being said, we're going to go ahead and we're going to install this Detroit locker. Okay, so here's our Detroit locker. If this was used, I would check for cracking or missing teeth in here, any sort of visible damage. This one's brand new, so it's pretty much good to go. As mentioned, make sure that there's no shims or washers. Before we install it, you can make sure that there's no heavy wear in here. It's not critical. If there is, you can just kind of clean it up, but you want to make sure that it's not severely damaged. The locker, as mentioned as well, it's caged. So you want to leave all this together, leave the wing nut and stuff on during install. So all we're going to do is set this in there. Our bowl gear goes on top, other half goes on, and we'll install our bolts here that hold the two halves together. And I'll show you what that looks like assembled. Okay, here's our carrier half together. You can see the Detroit is installed there. The bolts are in. The thing to keep in mind when installing these, they do have a hole that works with the crown nut here. When you're installing them, you want to make sure that the hole is running basically in line with the ring of bolts here. That way, once you get everything snugged up and tight, you can run the piece of lock wire that you originally seen when I cut it off around the whole ring of bolts here. The torque for these is 130 to 165 foot-pounds. And just when you're tightening them up, make sure you use a wrench on the back side to keep that hole parallel with the ring here. You can mark it with a paint pen if it helps. And once you're done that, then basically what you want to do is string a piece of bare mechanics wire through it, tie it off, and that'll keep these from ever backing out. Some guys like to use cotter pins through each one. I don't know if there's anything really wrong with it, and I'm sure if you have trouble stringing the wire through it, you could use that instead. I'm just used to doing it the way Rockwell does with a piece of mechanics wire, and it seems to work pretty good. So I'll get that done up, and we'll move on to the next step. Okay, just a little tip when you're running this wire through, I like to keep it kind of curled around the chunk like this, and that way as you're feeding it through each bolt hole, it doesn't really fight you too bad. You do have to be kind of gentle and just kind of work it as it goes. Once you kind of get a feel for it, it actually goes pretty smooth. Okay, now that we've got our bolts torqued and everything lock wired together, this Detroit locker that we have in here, I showed you that it was caged together with the wing nut. We can pull that out because the carrier halves are bolted together. There's no way the springs can release, so that's safe to do so now. You can pull that apart. I was also going to show before I installed anything, this is what we call a spool. It's just a billet chunk of steel. It splines both axle shafts together, permanently locking both tires from spinning separately from each other. These are a good, strong, and relatively inexpensive way to get a lot of traction out of your axles. All right, before we go to install our carrier, just going to flip this back over. We're going to install both our pinion seals. Pretty straightforward, as I mentioned. Make sure that there's no damage inside here from when you're removing it. Make sure there's no nicks or dings. If there is, clean it up good. Make sure there's no rust or dirt in there as well. These basically install pretty easy. You can tap them in with a hammer as long as you're very careful, or if you have a driver, you can drive them in as well. They do fit up against the shoulder here, so you can't go in too far. A lot of times if the seal is flush with the outer surface, that's fine as well. Okay, now that we have our seals installed, we have to install our yokes. What I like to do is just give the seal a little bit of oil. I'll put gear oil in a can. It's good to pump a little bit into these bearings, especially if they've been cleaned. We'll go ahead and install our yokes. There is some different opinions on these dust seals as well. In normal applications, they're good because they keep dirt and grit off of them. If you're using them in a mud truck, they have a tendency to pack full of mud inside here and actually tear out these seals. So a lot of times I'll take these off, especially if they're damaged. I'll just remove them. That way you can get in there and clean things after every ride. Keep dirt, grass, and stuff from piling up behind these seal dust covers here. Okay, now that we have our yoke installed, we want to go ahead and install our washer and nut. There is no seal on the splines here, so oil can seep through the splines. So what I recommend is before you install the washer, take and put a bead of silicone on the back side of it. I just use black RTV. Once you get that installed, torque up the castle nut here. Recommended torque spec is 300 to 600 foot-pounds, so it does have to be very tight. And then obviously just take it to the next notch where you can start your cotter pin, install your cotter pin, and your yokes are finished. From there, you can go and install your top cover. Same as the bearings, I like to put a little bit of oil on the gears, and you can also reach the bearings inside, give them a decent amount of oil Obviously these gears and bearings aren't going to see anything right away until the bowl gear feeds it up into this cavity here. So it's always good to give them a little extra oil during assembly. Okay, now that our yokes are on, everything's torqued, cotter pins are in, top cover's on, this pinion section is assembled. We're going to move on to the carrier, and this is where I do things a little bit differently from what the manual suggests, and I'm going to keep mentioning it, but this is specifically for the off-road guys that aren't driving, you know, long distances, but are, you know, abusing these chunks a lot, you know, putting a lot of extra horsepower to them. Say they're running even bigger axle shafts that are, you know, putting a lot of extra load through the carrier than what it was designed for. And what the issue is that I've come across is these adjusters here. They'll slide into these threaded fits, and the only thing that holds them in place is a little tab like this that locks it in place here. And what's happened is those side adjusters, what'll happen is they'll back off over time. They'll even wipe out these little tabs, bend them over, and keep spinning. And the issue that I've found is because it's a helical cut gear. I'm just going to pause it and I'll show you what I'm talking about. So here's a helical cut gear. That means that the teeth are at an angle. A spur or straight cut gear, obviously the teeth are straight. And when you have a helical cut gear, there's a lot of side load. So the gear below this one, the spur gear, is actually pushing things apart. So as you're accelerating and decelerating, there's a lot of side load, and all that side load is going through these side adjusters, and what happens is they'll tend to kind of back off with a lot of abuse. And the issue with that is as soon as these things back off and you lose your preload in these bearings, everything starts kind of flopping around, moving around, and I've seen these things like completely grenade because of that. And it'll even ruin lockers, it'll ruin the entire chunk, axle shafts. It's a really bad scenario. So I'm going to show you what I do to try and prevent that from happening. Okay, so as mentioned before, make sure that these threads on both the carrier and the caps are nice and clean. Threads in the housing for the bolts are nice and clean, and the bolts themselves are clean. Your bearing races, make sure that they're clean and dry. You don't even have to oil the insides of them yet. And then same with your adjuster rings, make sure that they're clean, all brake cleaned up and everything, and that you can test fit them before you do anything, and make sure that everything spins nice and smooth and there's nothing binding. And what we're going to do before we drop anything in is we're going to grab a bottle of this stuff. It's green Loctite, and it's specifically designed for retaining, for bearing retainers, and it'll help sort of glue things in place and keep them from moving side to side. So when everything's clean and dry, I'll put a little bead inside both saddles and then also on the threads as well. Once I've done that, I'm going to drop the carrier in with everything, and I'll show you that next step. Okay, so here's our carrier set in. You can see our races are here, our side adjusters are here. There's a little bead of green Loctite underneath of it. You have to be careful because when you set these in, it's really easy to get them cross-threaded. The easiest way to check to make sure that they're not is to make sure there's no gap on the bottom, and then make sure that they spin nice. If they kind of bind up or they don't turn nice, then you know something's wrong. You're going to want to pull them out and reinstall them, make sure everything's good to go. Next thing we're going to do is install the caps. Put a little bead green Loctite in there as well. Same thing as I did on the bottom. Just a dab like this, same with on the threads. Install them on top. I'll show you what that looks like next. Okay, so here's our caps installed, side adjusters. Same thing as I mentioned before. Be careful nothing is cross-threaded or in the wrong position. If it's in the right position, everything should go together quite nicely. Bolts will thread in by hand. Side adjusters will still move as long as this cap isn't snugged down. I'll use blue Loctite on these bolts, and what you want to do is adjust these side adjusters, and all you're doing is just eyeballing this gear, the bowl gear, to the spur gear, and then also making sure that none of the bolts hit on the housing. So I'm going to go ahead. Okay, here's the next thing that I'll mention is when you're centering this bowl gear up, the manual calls to put a dial indicator on the side of the gear, and then just to snug the adjuster nuts up until there's zero play in the bearings, and then basically just take it to the next notch where you can fit your lock tab in, like that. And as mentioned, if you're using this on the street or for long distances, then definitely do it exactly as the manual recommends. But if you're using it off-road, if you're throwing a lot of horsepower to it, what I like to do is take in an extra notch and give these bearings a little more preload to help hold everything together. Because as mentioned, if there's any sort of slop or play in here, these bearings are going to be crashing back and forth, loosening these adjusters off. So if you give them a little more preload, it'll help hold things together. If you go too much and you crank these things down, you know, zinging tight, what'll happen is it'll overheat these tapered bearings and you're going to run into a bunch of issues. So what I like to do is go an extra notch before you put any tabs or anything on, torque these down, and then just make sure that everything still spins nice, right? If it's too tight, then I would recommend loosening things off and starting over. So after that, you can torque these down. The cap bolts or recommended torque from the manual is 116 to 149 foot-pounds. Tighten them down, tighten your little lock tabs in, and then start the lock wiring process. I'm not gonna get into detail on that. If you wanna know how to lock wire things properly, look it up online. There's a whole bunch of instructions on how to do that. What I'll do is I'll just get that done. We'll flip this over and we're pretty much be wrapped up. Okay, here's everything lock wired together. The thing I'll mention about this is if you have a set of lock wire pliers like this, it's gonna make your life a lot easier. If not, just kind of do the best that you can. I've seen a whole pile of these things just kind of hand wrapped together, and I've really never ever seen one fail. I've actually seen the bolts loose when I've taken them apart, and really crappy tie wire jobs still holding things together. So don't get too concerned about this. Fair warning, tie wiring is like welding. If you end up posting pictures of this on the internet, even if you do it for NASA every day, there's going to be somebody smarter than you on the internet that's going to tell you did it wrong. So just do the best you can. I'm sure it'll work just fine, especially if these are Loctited. The chances of them coming loose are very, very slim. This is just an insurance policy. So as long as your wire is holding the bolt from backing off, you can see here it'll retain it from backing off, and it's somewhat tight, you should be good to go. Last thing I'll kind of do here is I didn't lubricate these bearings because I wanted to keep things dry for the Loctite. So I'll give them a couple squirts of gear oil just to make sure that they're lubricated during install. And then just kind of give things a spin. As long as nothing hits, nothing rubs, should be good to go. Drop that in and you should be quite happy with it. I've done a lot of these, and the way that I've done it here is exactly how I've done them, and they've all lasted quite well. I've never really had any failures or anything yet. So yeah, keep some good oil in it, run it, and thanks for watching. Hope to see you guys again. Thanks.